Hi everyone, today we're working on lesson 3, perfect squares. You might already know what perfect squares are, but today we're going to reiterate that. So let's get started. Today's lesson 3, so I'm going to open up the Wednesday folder, clicking on today's notes. Lesson 3, perfect squares. I can list perfect squares up to and including 225. Today is a memorization day. There are certain numbers that you just need to know are perfect squares. So a perfect square is a number that is the product of two equal factors. So in simple terms, that means it's a product, so an answer to multiplication that comes from multiplying two of the same number. For example, 5 times 5. Those are two of the same number, right? The 5 and the 5. Those are two equal factors. Okay, that's the same thing as squaring 5 squared, and that gives us 25. So therefore, 25 is a perfect square because it is the product of two equal factors. So if you take the square root of 25 in your calculator, remember, we're back to square roots now, no cube roots until tomorrow again. So if you press second x squared in your scientific calculator and you type in 25, it comes out nice and pretty. It's a 5. Okay, just a couple of reminders typing in the square roots in these calculators. We just type in a 25, then you press this button right here and we get 5. If you're working with the graphing calculator, you are pressing second x squared and typing in 25. That's how we do square roots there. Okay, another example I have for you is 8 times 8, which is the same thing as squaring 8, gives us 64. Therefore, 64 is a perfect square because it is the product of two equal factors. So if we take the square root of 64, you're going to see it's going to come out nice and pretty. No crazy long decimals. They are rational numbers and whole numbers. Okay, so it's the numbers that they multiply to. Those are called perfect squares. So the easiest way to write out perfect squares is to start with 1 and then just keep going. There are an infinite number of perfect squares. We can go on until we die. We can keep going for years, okay? They never end. For you, I want you to memorize up to 225. So that does not mean to memorize 225 numbers. They're just certain numbers between 1 and 225. So we're going to fill in the table below to find the perfect squares up to 225. Okay, so I always like to start with 1. So if I'm trying to find a perfect square and we're starting with 1, we are going to start with saying multiplying that factor by itself. So let's do 1 times 1. And in other words, that's a fancy way of writing. And again, I'm copying and pasting all these equations just to make my life easier. 1 times 1 is the same thing as 1 squared. And 1 squared is 1. So a perfect square is 1, because if we take the square root of 1, it comes out nice and pretty. The next one, let's go to 2. 2 times 2. That's how we would find its perfect square, because we multiply it by itself. That's going to be the same thing as, you guessed it, 2 squared. And 2 squared, or 2 times 2, is 4. So far we have 1, 4. Let's figure out what's going to come next. Okay, I'll do one more with you. We go to 3 now. So to find out the perfect square that goes along with 3, we do 3 times 3, multiplying it by itself. That's the same thing as 3 squared. 3 squared is not 6. I get that mistake a lot. Double check it in your calculator. 3 times 3 is 9. 6 is not a perfect square. Okay, pause the video. I want you to fill in the perfect squares that go along with 4 through 15. It's the grayed out squares that we need to memorize. Okay, check your work with my work. Remember, the important numbers that you need to memorize are the numbers that say perfect squares. You don't need to memorize all this work. I just need you to know where they come from. Because when I say memorize, I mean, you really don't need to memorize them because you can find them through your calculator. But those numbers you really need to work on recognizing as perfect squares. When you take the square root of them, they'll come out nice and pretty. If you have questions, please let me know and make sure you self-assess for today's lesson.